What hope do we have to stand up against the violence of state power? They have the guns, they have the training, they have the resources, they have the money. What do we have? For that matter, if the government won't do anything about global warming, what can we do? That's the question we'll look at today in Resilience in Dark Times. Our guest today is Kieran Knutson, who's a labor organizer, and he's been active for decades in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And he was at the center of the resistance to ICE and the general strike that took place there. Today, we'll be talking about people power. We'll be talking about collective action. Today in Resilience in Dark Times, taking back our power through a general strike with Kieran Knutson. You're listening to Resilience in Dark Times. I'm your companion and guide, Michael Glavin. Whatever brought you here, I'm glad you found us. This is a space for honest conversation, practical strategies, and the kind of hope that comes from facing reality together. Let's dive in. Happy May Day! Hello and welcome to this special episode. We have a special guest with us today, Kieran Knutson. He's an old friend and comrade. He's here to tell us the fascinating story about how Minneapolis, St. Paul were able to expel ICE and the CBP, the Customs and Border Patrol agents. It's a really detailed, really awesome story. He goes into all the details about, first the rapid response networks that grew up and out of the crisis that was happening, all the way through the mutual aid networks that grew, and all the way to culminating in a general strike. So without further ado, let me introduce Kieran. So Kieran Knutson is a call center worker in the telecom industry and elected president of the CWA Local 7250. Kieran is a longtime anti-fascist activist and was also one of the founders of Anti-Racist Action, a youth-based direct action anti-fascist network. Kieran lives in Minneapolis with his partner, who is active in the nurses union. They've raised 2 grown sons who are also active in the movement against ICE. Without further ado, Kieran Knutson. Kieran, it's great to see you. I'm so glad to have you on Resilience in Dark Times. Let me tell you a little bit about the podcast to give you a context for why we want to have you here and why I think you're really the best guest at this time. So Resilience in Dark Times, we look at resilience. How can one be resilient in the face of authoritarianism and climate change? And most stuff on talk on resilience has to do with the individual, like how to feel better, how to think differently. But these are collective threats. And so I think to be truly resilient, it's not just about how you feel or coping mechanisms or how you think. We really need to respond collectively to deal with the source of distress. So the source of authoritarianism or climate change, and that requires collective action. But as Americans, we're pretty individualistic. We don't think collectively. We generally tend to not know how to band together, how to take collective action. So that's where you come in. And your experience in Minneapolis, St. Paul, for decades now, but also most recently with the pushing out ICE and the resistance to ICE and the day of action that was there. So that's the general background. So can you give us a little bit of history on Minneapolis, St. Paul and what the context was even before ICE came in?
Yeah, first let me just say I'm honored to be a guest on your show, and I think it is an important topic and one I probably need to take more seriously too, just about resiliency. I think a lot of people here have been thinking about that, dealing with all the stress and anxiety and fear and courage. So glad to be a part of this discussion. The Twin Cities is, sort of the major urban area of the upper Midwest. It's got a large university. It's got, a a big working class. It's also got a big middle class, and it's got some significant, corporate ruling class institutions as well. And there's also been a long history of struggle here, as there is everywhere, but in particular, there's been a history of both of labor struggle, of Native American struggles for sovereignty and self-defense. There's been a strong feminist and LGBTQ movement and community here. There's been, a fierce anti-racist movement, and there's been a presence of anarchists and other radicals here for decades as well. So that's some of the background. I guess like the ethnic makeup, the Twin Cities is still relatively white compared to other metropolitan areas in the U.S. But there is a large immigrant community, particularly from Mexico and Latin America, and from Somalia and East Africa. And then there's also other newer ethnic groups from Liberia and Burma, Ecuador. So that there's a fairly, within the cities and within the working class suburbs, there's a growing sort of multiracial working class.
Great. So that's the context. And then why do you think the Trump administration targeted Minneapolis, St. Paul?
Yeah, I think it's something a lot of us have speculated about, and we don't have sort of a definitive document that proves what the intention was. But it seems to me that there's a few things that made the Twin Cities a target. One of them was that the Twin Cities, had this sort of historic uprising against police brutality and white supremacy after George Floyd was murdered by Minneapolis police in 2020. And it was a kind of rebellion that really shook, institutions and communities all around the world. There's still, in sporting events, there still is official anti-racist messaging because of that uprising. It's just sort of one lingering little effect that I think we kind of sometimes forget about. But really, it meant that there was this tremendous amount of organizing and defiance. And that was particularly strong in Minneapolis, where, for instance, the 3rd Precinct, where the cops had come from that killed George Floyd, was sacked and had to be abandoned by the police. And that for several weeks in Minnesota, or in Minneapolis in particular, there were no police really functioning. And so the community sort of had to figure out, what does that mean then? How do we self-police? How do we organize for our own safety when these institutions that are supposedly about safety are really attacking us? And I think that the ruling class was never content with how this has played out, especially the more right-wing sections. Trump had wanted and encouraged a policy of opening fire on protesters during 2020. And the Democratic Party leadership, which dominates politics in Minnesota, was smart enough to know that, if they had done that, that people would have started shooting back, and that would have opened up a whole other can of worms in terms of stability and being able to put down the rebellion. And so they had a different strategy that was more, a long-term one of co-optation and containment. And that sort of has won out, but it has left the right wing dissatisfied with results. Right. And so I think that was an element. The other element is just, the Somali community in particular seems to have become something that Trump is obsessed with, for racist reasons. They're obviously from Africa. They're a Black ethnic group. They're Muslim. They're immigrants. So they seem to hit kind of all of the boxes that gets Trump's attention. And I think they were hoping also that it would be sort of a group that would be easy to villainize across the U.S.
Right.
And I think, at least in the Twin Cities, that's turned out not to be the case, that enough people of lots of different ethnicities have now grown up with Somali people, work with Somali people, run into Somali people at the grocery store or, the doctor's clinic or wherever it might be. And so it has not been successful in terms of dividing people in the Twin Cities, but its effect nationally, I think they thought this would be something they could easily sort of make into a villain. And finally, I think maybe they thought that the Twin Cities was going to be easy in some sense. I mentioned before how the Twin Cities are still more white compared to other cities. I think there was maybe a sense that Minnesota was its liberalism and maybe its large middle class meant that people would not fight back in sort of a fierce way, as you can imagine what might happen in Chicago or LA if they had started executing people in the street there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the response might be different than it would have been in Chicago or LA, but it was still strong and, stepped up to meet the moment. So I'm proud of, my hometown for that reason.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll get into that in a little bit, but let's talk about the initial response, because I think the initial response was similar to what we were doing here in Chicago in terms of whistles and going out and documenting what was happening. And I know a lot of the people, the organizers in Chicago, trained some of the people in St. Paul, Minneapolis. And so you all were the benefits of what we learned here, but then you added a lot onto it. So but for people who aren't familiar, what were those initial days before the day of action? What was the organizing like?
Yeah, you're totally right. And it's also really important to acknowledge that we did learn a lot from Chicago and LA and other cities. These rapid response networks, I think, were the main sort of innovation that has been developed in this period. And they're really what it means is building these community networks that look out for each other and are able to mobilize quickly. I joked that 6 months, if you would have asked me which of your neighbors would come out in the streets with you to confront federal police, I might have said, well, I don't know, nobody, I don't know. But it turns out that actually dozens and dozens and hundreds and sometimes thousands of people were willing to come out. And so there were these, like you mentioned, there were different organizers connected with people in Chicago. Other people from immigrant rights groups have been sort of thinking through these issues for years. And they really started to scale a kind of rapid response network and encourage people and organize people to start building them in every neighborhood they could. And then, of course, once a neighborhood got off the ground and people started hearing about it, then other neighborhoods would replicate it. And so, for instance, in the neighborhood where my partner and I live, there were 800 people on a Signal chat just in our neighborhood for a rapid response.
That is awesome.
And all kinds of sort of subcommittees that grew out of that 800. And then there were at least 80 other loops similar to our neighborhoods across the Twin Cities. So just in terms of the scale of people's involvement, there were tens of thousands of people trained to be what they call observers or constitutional observers, but really playing the role of challenging ICE and coming out to defend neighbors who were facing abduction, similar to what Renee Good and Alex Preddy were doing.
Right.
So that was one sort of a key part of organizing, because it really started to spread all across and made it a way for almost anybody to get plugged in. And often people that were looking for ways to get plugged in would get, but unsure how to, because maybe they're not connected to the movement or to activist groups, but all of a sudden one of their neighbors might be asking them to join. And so it became a sort of gateway for people to get involved and get plugged in and start doing something, which is, I think, what a lot of people want to do in this situation.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the different roles? Because some people will be like, well, I don't want to be on the streets directly confronting ICE, but so I can't get involved. But that's not true. There's many different ways that people have been getting involved. Can you talk a little bit about that?
For sure. It was great to see not only, I mean, the networks were initially organized around the idea that we would come out to support people who were facing abduction in our neighborhood. But it quickly morphed into more projects. For instance, there was sort of in order to coordinate ICE response, there were people that were watching them outside of the federal building where they were staging from, and then being able to communicate the license plates numbers, the number of vehicles, the description of the vehicles as they were heading out, And that made it easier for neighborhoods to understand when ice was headed to their community or through their community. So there were people that were doing that kind of observation. There were also people that were observing the flights, the deportation flights. So we were able to keep sort of our own statistics and view of how many deportations were happening and how often, and when they were leaving MSP, the airport here. But in addition to all of this sort of stuff directly around ICE and their movement and activities in the Twin Cities, there was also the support for the community that happened. So in this situation where you have 4,000 ICE agents, and keep in mind that the MPD is less than 800 cops and the St. Paul Police Department is less than 600 cops. So when you have 4,000 agents, descended on your state, it's a huge, you notice them. Everybody would see them. Even though they're in unmarked vehicles, it would become frequent for people to see them. People would joke that you didn't want to be in an SUV with an out-of-state license plate because people would assume you were ICE because there were so many of them.
Yeah.
But it also meant that so many workers, especially undocumented workers, and especially I would say Latino workers, a big part of the Latino working class in the Twin Cities just went underground, just stopped going to work and school for like 2 months. Wow. And of course, you can't do that and still pay for groceries and rent and get your kids to school and all those kinds of things. And so one of the big things that these rapid response networks started to do was to do mutual aid. That became kind of the umbrella term for all of this. So, for instance, there were churches that were, putting out bags, thousands of bags of groceries every night. There was unions that were doing that for their members, particularly the hotel workers union had a big mutual aid effort underway where they were making sure that their members who were, largely or significantly Latino, and many of them undocumented, would get groceries. There were other folks who were making sure the kids got to and from their after school programs, who got picked up. There was a school district in one of the suburbs that described ICE as using their students for bait, as bait to catch parents.
Wow.
So in that situation, it was useful to have people that were not, did not have concerns about citizenship to be able to pick up kids and get them home safely. So all those kinds of things were going on simultaneously. And some people were doing a lot of, doing several of those things, although we tried to sort of separate, if you're going to be doing kind of confronting ICE, because ICE was taking down our license plates too. In fact, there were people who would follow ICE and then ICE would drive to their homes because ICE had they'd looked up people's license plates, and then sort of as a fear tactic, they would just drive to whoever was following them to their homes as a way of showing that they knew who they were. So we try to keep those folks, or those vehicles anyways, separate from the vehicles that were doing mutual aid stuff, because we didn't want to. And then there was this stuff that happened in the labor movement as well that I think we'll talk about more too.
Yeah. And then there was the killings of Goodman and Preddy, right? And things sort of escalated. Was the Day of Action planning happening before that, or did it grow out of that? Like, because that was a serious escalation at that point.
It was. So the history of that is that, really for a couple of years now, a number of different unions have been trying to think about two things. One is how to converge our struggles together, because different unions in different industries have different contracts and expiration dates. And so we're all kind of fighting against the big corporate bosses, but on our own in different lanes. And so our strength is watered down in that way. So there was some discussion about, well, how do we start combining our struggles, even if they're against different employers? And then connected to that was the idea of, can we use our labor power in actions beyond just our contract expirations? In Europe and in Latin America, other parts of the world, it's not uncommon for unions to go on strike over political issues, not just over, bread and butter contract issues. You see that frequently in France or Brazil, for instance, where there might be a general strike around a policy, a government policy. So these discussions had been happening, and unions had been working together on joint mobilizations. And then there were also groups of, radical workers that had been starting to organize what we called workers' assemblies, which was a chance for people from across different unions, different industries, different ages and ethnic groups, different neighborhoods to get together around specific topics. So there was an assembly organized around when Trump was elected about what kinds of attacks are coming our way and how to be ready. There was an assembly organized around immigration and the specific attacks happening on immigrant workers. And there was an assembly organized around the general strike and the concept of a general strike and getting that idea out there. And a general strike, for those who don't know, is everybody going on strike together at once, basically, so that it generalizes the struggle across the society and really brings the economy to a halt. At least that's the idea of it. Mm-hmm. So these all were happening prior to Operation Metro Surge. And additionally, nationally, the United Auto Workers, under a new leadership, had been suggesting the idea of unions aiming for 2028 as a date to try and get your expiration dates lined up so that a number of unions in different industries could potentially strike together. But with Trump's election, we started to say 2028 is awfully far away. We might need to start thinking about being able to do this sooner. And then when the Operation Metro Surge was announced, we really started thinking, okay, we might be having to do this like this year. Let's start talking and thinking about that. And then when Renee Good was killed, we decided that actually we can't wait at all, and we need to pick a date and go into motion. And that's what happened with a number of the Twin Cities unions.
Great. And then how did you do the organizing in leading up to that date? Like how did you convince your members that this is part of our struggle and other unions? Right. and
Absolutely. So in our local, we had already started to do some education early in the ICE operation. They had arrested or they had abducted 2 Laotian men who were members of our union, but not our local, but of a sister local in St. Cloud at a factory that produces electric buses. And these 2 union brothers had been working in this factory for 20 years. They were both in their 50s. They had both come from Laos when they were preschoolers. So they'd lived in this country almost their entire lives and had built, laid down roots in the community and had families. One of them was a grandfather. The other one was a devout Buddhist. And, they'd gotten in trouble when they were in their teens. When they were young adults and had served the time for it, like a lot of American workers have as well. And they had been working in this job for over 20 years and members of the union there. So when they were abducted and we found out about it, we used their cases as a way to, we just distributed, their families had produced GoFundMes to try and support the families. So we kind of did a flyer about the case of these 2 men as a way of sort of humanizing them, because Trump was saying that they were going after, sort of the worst of the worst. Right. This idea that, it was like serial killers or, just the most awful people that you can imagine, but really, it was regular working class people who they were going after. And so that was part of what we did, is to lay kind of the foundation of like education in our local. And I think other locals did similar things. We also, the unions that had built infrastructures of organization and the unions that had organized struggles, either strikes or militant contract campaigns, not surprisingly, were also unions that were able to mobilize around this issue. And the thing I found out when we were distributing information about these 2 Laotian men was that some of our members had already gotten involved in their rapid response group. So people that were maybe pro-union, but not necessarily union activists, I'd hand them a flyer and they were like, oh, they showed me their whistle. So I had 2, white women show me this early on. And I'm like, okay, this is actually starting to infect the workplace. And it also makes it easier to talk about the issue when you already have people in the union who are thinking about it already, and not only thinking about it, but actually getting involved on their own.
Right.
And that made it easier for us to talk about. But we, we're a democratic union, so we laid out the issues and we talked about it with our membership and at our executive board level and at our membership level, which is our highest body. And we voted to participate in January 23rd. And that sort of was happening in a bunch of other unions as well, and with their own dynamics of how that happens. But also, it was in the context of like everything in the society looking at this. Like if you turned on local TV news anytime during the surge, it was almost, I joked it was like resistance TV, because you turn on the local news and it would just be about, in this neighborhood, ICE was confronted, or here's a church where they're organizing groceries. I mean, this was what the local news was. So basically, everybody was thinking about this stuff all the time. And that also pushed the unions, I think, to take action, because people were going to start taking action with or without the unions.
Right.
And I think a lot of people thought, well, we need to contribute, and also we can help. There's a contribution we can make to this struggle. And that's sort of, how it came to be.
That's really great and inspirational. I mean, we on the left talk all the time about how when the people take action and get out in the streets, then the leaders eventually will follow. So it sounds like it was similar in terms of the unions didn't want to be left behind. They were like, oh, this is a movement now. People are taking action. People are out there. Let's join in with this. So it's safe politically to join in with what the workers want and what their own membership wants.
Absolutely. One really cool thing that I found out sort of since Metro Surge was, beaten back, is that a lot of action was happening among non-union workers as well. And I know that because we've had 3 groups of workers approach us about unionizing since Metro Surge. And in each case, they had either shut down their workplace on January 23rd or they had tried to.
Oh, great.
And so that just shows there was like all this kind of autonomous activity happening. And also people that were starting to connect the dots in terms of like, hey, they were conscious of what they had just done. They had organized their coworkers in order to take action. And so they were looking to be able to do that going forward as well.
That is so inspirational. And so let's talk about the day itself. And I know it's been called a general strike, but I think in a lot of ways it technically wasn't. So can you talk about that and like what you did and how it differs from a general strike, or what a general strike would look like, and those details?
Yeah, I think sometimes maybe there's been, I mean, I think we should be honest and realistic about what we did and how we did it. But also I think there's a sort of petty and sectarian way sometimes people are talking about it in a way about, oh, whether it qualified or not, did it fit this criteria? I'll just say that how it functionally happened was that many unions and also the broader movement put out a call for no work, no school, and no shopping. And functionally how we did that, because most unions have contracts that include no strike clauses. That's the general standard way contracts exist under U.S. labor law, is that you do not have a right to go on strike unless your contract is expired. But what we did is encourage our members to use their time, use whatever mechanism they could to stay home and to be a part of the action that day.
Great.
And that's what other unions did too. So in some ways it might be equivalent to like a sick out or something like that.
Right.
But it got mass participation. And I'll just give a couple examples. In our local, and we represent telecom workers primarily, but also other groups of workers. In the retail stores that sell like cell phones and cell phone plans, we had heard back from our union stewards that management was threatening people, hey, if you call out on sick on January 23rd, we're going to investigate you. And so we got on their ass right away about it, because that's illegal. People have a right to call out sick, and they can't do that. And I think that, and also the rest of the pressure in the society, within 24 hours, management had totally changed their tune. They said, actually, the vacation books are open. Anybody who wants to take a vacation, because usually in the retail stores, only one worker at a time can be out on vacation.
Right.
So they said the vacation books are open. And not only that, if you don't want to use one of your vacation days, you can have an excused unpaid day too.
Wow.
So that really made it much easier for people that were on the fence about whether to participate or not to participate. Many retail stores were only stayed open because management was kept running them. One of those stores we totally shut down. The call center that I work at had, I think, 85% participation. We represent a big group of video game quality assurance workers, 300 workers there, and that facility just shut down completely because of the mass participation. People had indicated they were going to be out that day. So that's kind of the way it functioned, was kind of like a sick out, if you would.
Yeah.
And I still, however, it qualifies as something, whether we call it a general strike or a mass strike or
it definitely
whatever. It was a
does.
workers' action.
Yeah.
And it did catch the attention in the way that people had hoped, in both good and bad ways. I mean, there was a march of 100,000 people in like 15 below weather in downtown Minneapolis.
Yeah, I saw that. It was amazing. It was so cold.
It was really cold.
Wow.
It was like, where but I think it was amazing. Yeah, like you said, it was amazing that people turned out. And then we did a survey of kind of all of our workplaces, and we found that we had over 80% of our members stayed home that day.
Wow, that's amazing.
So I think that was probably, we have a high level of organization in our local, and we've stressed this and pushed it. So I don't know that other unions had the same kind of numbers, but I think that I know for a fact there was mass absenteeism at the airport, in transit, in the schools, So there was tons and tons of workers who participated. And what I was going to say about the reaction was that the next weekday, 60 Minnesota CEOs put out a letter to Trump basically calling for de-escalation. I mean, it was a very lame letter. It was very,
of course,
but it indicated that dissent amongst the rich, and that they thought what was happening was creating instability. Yeah, and they had to frame it. Yeah, sorry.
So yeah, let's, before we get to that, let's for the people who don't understand, like, why general strike, like, why should people not go to school or go to work? How does that relate to, immigration? Can you talk about the theory behind it, like why that can be an effective strategy?
Yeah, totally. So the idea is that we can do protests and we can do, lobbying and these kinds of things. But what kind of leverage do we really have as regular people? We don't have the millions and billions of dollars that the corporations have. We're not able to sort of buy politicians. We're not able to influence official policy in the way that the rich and powerful can. But what we do have is we have our numbers, and then we have our leverage in the sense of our labor, that our labor creates the profits, for these corporations. And that the withdrawal of our labor gets their attention very quickly because it can start cutting into their profits, which is their main motivating factor in almost everything they do. And it can kind of force the corporations to take a stand on this one way or the other, or to attempt to influence things. So if we're not able to sort of change, the Trump regime's opinion based on our moral arguments, if we're not able to change their opinions or their actions based on our direct action in the streets, what else can we do? And that's sort of the theory. And connected to that is this piece of information that one of the janitors union shared with me. And I looked it up and they were right. It was true, but it had passed me by in the news cycle. Was that when Trump was laying out his, the cities that he wanted ICE to do operations in, initially he had said San Francisco was one of them. And of course, San Francisco is known as a liberal city and all that, so it made sense. But then he never sent ICE to San Francisco, and I never had kind of caught on why. But the reason was because one of the big, Silicon Valley billionaire tech dudes tech bros had basically sent a letter to Trump saying, we don't need you, because they knew that this would cause chaos, that there would be probably some important people that were rounded up from their industry and this kind of thing. And Trump had obeyed that request. He had said, okay, well, they don't need us. You're a good friend of mine. We won't do that. So it kind of showed where Trump will take direction from. And so that was in our minds as we organized this day of action, was that we were going to put pressure on the corporations in Minnesota, who will then put pressure on the state.
Great. Yeah, and we've talked about on the show before about how, the No Kings marches and stuff like that are really great in terms of, letting people know that we're with them, building solidarity, consciousness raising, seeing our own numbers and our own power. But like in in a working liberal democracy, the politicians pay attention to that and like, oh, we should do what our voters want. But in authoritarianism, that doesn't mean anything. That has no influence. So we need to look for other means, right? And so direct action and economic strikes, like you're saying, the labor power, using our labor power, using our consumer power, like that can get the ruling class to pay attention, because now we're hitting their profit books, and now they can influence Trump, because that's the only people he listens to. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think it did have an impact.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So
Yeah. So the CEOs put out this letter. At the same time, though, um, the state responded by executing Alex Preddy, uh, who was a
right,
union member, was a nurse at the VA hospital, and had been a participant in the rapid response networks. And
right,
so it's hard, when you look at what happened, it's hard not to think that, because I think a lot of our discussion about ICE has been that ICE is this kind of rogue group of um, untrained, knuckleheads. And there's aspects of that are true. They definitely did recruit a ton of people with a mixed group of experience, and they've sort of given them, carte blanche to carry out abductions however they want. So there is a kind of messiness, clumsiness, and brutality that seems kind of untrained and wild about it. But there's also actually really well trained and very, specific tasked forces that are part of this as well,
right,
including the Border Patrol agents. Both the agent that killed Renee Good and the agents that killed Alex Preddy were not new people. They were not sort of security guards that had gotten jobs as ICE. They were long-term federal law enforcement. And in both cases, I think if we look at it with a little bit more distance, a little more coolness, the actions don't seem so random and wild. They seem much more purposeful.
right.
And to me, that means that they were given specific permission, to shoot people in certain circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And that when those circumstances presented themselves, they thought, for instance, Renee Good is in a vehicle and Alex Preddy had a firearm, although he was not holding it or carrying it and it was legal. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
that in those cases that they had permission to shoot somebody. And
Right.
I think also the fact that the January 23rd was so powerful and, it had really turned the tide in terms of public sentiment. It showed this leverage that we had and put that on the table, for the corporations like, hey, if you want to keep having this happen, um, then then stay silent and it's going to keep happening.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that this felt like a response as well from from the feds, from the Trump regime, that um, they wanted to really, try and scare people, try and create fear, try and retaliate. And that, the standoff that happened with ICE over the next few hours after they murdered Alex Preddy showed that, this was it was a very disciplined and determined group of agents that stayed to fight the community for several hours, just pumping tons and tons of
Mm-hmm.
tear gas into the air and rubber bullets flying and flashbang grenades. But they were doing so in a very organized and disciplined way,
Right.
and not sort of in a Wild West, cowboy way.
Yeah, that's my reading of it as well. That the brutality they exhibited was, but that was on purpose, and that's what authoritarians and fascists do: is they brutalize and they say, "We're going to do this. You can't stop us." And so, they killed Renee Good, and then they didn't back off. There wasn't an investigation. In fact, there was a cover up, and then they did it again just to say, we're just going to do this, and we're going to keep doing
Yep.
this. And so you better back down or else. But Minneapolis, St. Paul didn't back down. People
Right.
still showed up. Even more people came to the streets.
Yeah, it's true.
Heroic, heroic stuff from ordinary citizens, ordinary people, just getting out in the streets and doing what they can. It's very inspirational.
Yeah, it was heartening. It would have
Yeah,
been, as sort of anxious and as you know, depressing and scary as it all was, it would have been so much more depressing if people hadn't responded the way they did.
right,
And that was
right,
really something that I think a lot of us held on to and was heartening and gave us
mhm,
strength and confidence to keep going.
right. Yeah, and like you're saying, I think part of it was a miscalculation on their part, right? Because fascist authoritarians will target, a minority group and
Yeah,
demonize that group, and they think, okay, no one's going to stand up or identify with this group, and
right.
yet the people in St. Paul, Minneapolis, did stand up and did protect all the community members, and then the people who were killed, m- the white America could very easily identify with. These
Mhm,
weren't like these were, a nurse for crying out loud, this really sweet Minnesota woman.
mhm.
People who could see their sister, their mom, their friend, like, yeah,
Yep. I think that's all true and is representative of they very much, especially in Minnesota, I think they people felt like they knew people exactly like
right,
Renee Good and Alex Preddy, and I
yeah,
think that and then also there was a real impact of the George Floyd uprising in the sense of sort of in a technical sense where people had created loops of communication
mm,
uh, that popped up in different neighborhoods when the police were off the streets, um, and people that had been resilient in terms of organizing actions and holding ground and holding space.
mm,
That all those kinds of lessons had been learned sort of on a mass scale in 2020, and so there was people that had um, that experience, and also people that maybe weren't a part of that experience because they were too young or they were just weren't in that mind space, or or they didn't live here yet, or whatever it might be. But I think there's a lot of people who align with that now, who sort of psychologically hold on to what happened in
right,
2020 as part of who the community is and who
mm,
they are as well. And that's really an interesting thing because I think it sort of it creates this expectation that we are going to try and do the right thing, even if it's
mhm,
scary,
right,
and we're not afraid to stand up.
yeah,
Um, and I think that's something that is not so easily it's not so easy for the state to take away from us.
right,
Like once
right,
that's really embedded itself in the culture, then then I think it's it's a great asset to have in terms of organizing and mobilizing and resisting.
right. And the state sort of, the Trump regime showed its hand in terms of the authoritarianism of it. It's, the rhetoric is we're going after the worst of the worst, only the killers, and no, they're going against anyone who stands against them, right? So you can be a nurse and with a whistle and you're going to die, right? Like it
Yeah,
doesn't matter. And so then that that's a wake up call for everyone, right? So let's
absolutely.
yeah, let's talk about. So you said the some CEOs in Minnesota wrote a very tame letter, but they
Mhm.
they said like, hey, kind of like back off a little bit. Like, yeah, what was the aftermath of the day of
Yeah,
action?
so then I think in my read of it is what happened was there was sort of this combination of effects. Um, there was the unions and others putting sort of work stoppages on the agenda or
Mm,
on the put it on the table like this is what we can do and we're able to do it. And then there was the
right. So
mass.
the threat that
Yeah,
this was going to grow and that it
yeah,
was going to continue. Right. So it
yeah,
wasn't just this one action that,
right,
labor is starting to
right,
get organized, they're starting to coordinate. Yeah.
right.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I mean, from our point of view, in terms of the mobilization, the action was extremely successful. And
Hmm.
so I think anybody with open eyes who's sort of trying to read the situation is able to see, okay, they pulled that off. They're
Right.
capable of doing this.
Right.
And so that's something to note, because I think maybe over the years there's been a lot of times people have called for general strikes that have never got it past their sort of low political scene. This was actually a real thing.
Yeah.
And then I think there was
Yeah,
just
in my lifetime, there have been so many calls for general
yeah,
strikes, right?
right, right,
And so it was
right.
amazing to see it actually work. It was like,
Yeah,
whoa, Minneapolis,
right.
St. Paul pulled it off. Like that was
Yeah.
amazing and so inspirational. Like you guys
It,
did such great work.
it's often a good idea, but this time it
Mhm.
went beyond that, the good
Yeah.
idea. And I mean, and that the context again too was just the sort of revulsion at the brutality that was
Mhm.
just widespread across the society. So, for instance, in my workplace, there's people that voted for Trump who had been pretty jazzed about stuff, in the early months of his second term, and were,
Mhm.
had their chest puffed up and all that, and they started definitely quieting down during all this, and they sort of
Mhm.
like, and I think that was happening in a broad way. Like there were a lot of people who just were disgusted by what happened, and even the people that maybe were secretly supportive of Trump didn't feel like they could be vocally that way because it was so shameful, the
Yeah.
conduct of ICE, and there was no, there was no room for it in terms of the society didn't want to hear it.
Right.
And I think so. All those things combined to where I think the authorities thought this is creating chaos. It could result in things like work stoppages or riots or other disruptive things to to our profitability and our operations. And they couldn't see like where is this going to end? How is this going to? And so they started to put pressure on the Trump government to you know to disengage and to back down.
Right.
Um, and so they sent people. They canned this Bovino, this little
Mhm.
Nazi that was running the operation here. They canned
Mhm.
him. Um, they brought in somebody to negotiate with the local authorities so that it wouldn't be a complete surrender, but a sort of scaled back retreat.
Mhm.
And they started sending agents to back home or to other states. And so,
Yeah.
over several weeks, and it was not immediate, they scaled from about, several thousand agents up to 4,000 agents down to around 400, which is still a huge
Yeah.
ICE mobilization. Actually, it's the biggest mobilization in ICE's history, except for when they had
Wow.
4,000.
Wow.
So it's bigger, for instance, than what they sent to Chicago, even
Yeah.
still.
Yeah.
So they are still doing abductions. They're doing them
Yeah.
quieter, less dramatically, mostly.
Mhm.
Although, like, a month ago, they grabbed someone off a bus stop and put a black bag over his head in St.
Oh,
Paul. So
oh,
there's there's weird stuff that's still happening,
yeah.
but they've scaled it way, way back. And, they've tried to change the national narrative with their next disaster or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and I imagine once the midterms are done, they'll be right back in force again.
It
Um,
could be. I mean, a lot of it we'll see. I mean, my sense is that the ruling class in general is getting a little sick of Trump and just his unpredictability, sort of the chaos that his policies create in terms of like the tariffs, this war with Iran,
mhm.
and the choking of oil and other supplies. Um, the way he's sort of the way he carried out this anti-immigrant campaign didn't win him support. It cost him a lot of support. And
Mhm.
so I think it would not be surprising to me if they, try and harness him in and prepare to replace him with somebody else. But I think a lot of the tools. I mean, historically, what's happened is the tools that are assembled. One, they were not all just assembled by Trump. A lot of that
Right.
stuff existed prior, and they're not all going to get put away when Trump is gone.
Right.
These tools of repression are going to be, I think, present in our society.
Yeah, and it's scary to think of someone who's smarter and more tactical,
Hmm.
getting in charge and using those tools
Right,
more effectively. Yeah.
right.
So let's talk about lessons learned in the way forward. in terms of direct action and general strikes. And yeah, what lessons did you guys learn, and what are you thinking about for the next action?
So this is an ongoing discussion, trying to absorb all this and take some time to talk through and to, so many different people were involved in so many different facets of the resistance that just sort of getting everybody's stories together and what people saw and heard has been important, and but also a little time consuming. And then, taking some time to really think the stuff through and analyze it, so we're not just going off of hot takes or whatever, but actually trying to put some thought into it. But so there's all the kinds of tactical innovations that we talked about earlier, and I think those are really important, and those are fairly easily, you know, to replicate other places. They'll, each community is going to have its own way of doing things and going to find better ways to do it in their particular situation. So there's all those kinds of tactical innovations that I think will be useful. And we've done a good job. Some friends did a speaking tour recently in a bunch of cities in the Midwest and East and West coasts, and are conveying a lot of those lessons. But I think sort of bigger political lessons. I think one that's really important to hit home, because those of us that grew up in the U.S., particularly if you're white, I think there's a certain sort of like expectation for this certain kind of liberal democracy, and I think this was really revealing that that we have rulers and enemies that are brutal and vicious and murderous, and that they are willing to kill people. And I think that is it's something that's really important to sort of really absorb and to understand in terms of how we're moving and organizing, is that our enemies are capable of the most brutality.
Right.
And I think another lesson is that we can't and we shouldn't rely on a great savior to come fix the situation, whether it's a politician or anyone else. That even if you think that the political system is a place to have a struggle, it's not useful to make that the strategy when you're under attack. That in fact there was a lot of slogans came out of Minnesota or were used a lot, like for instance just sort of like no one is coming to save us, or who keeps us safe, we keep us safe. These were like mantras that were repeated by lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds, in big audiences. These were kinds of like center points of how people describe things. So I think the idea that we have to build our own infrastructure of resistance is important. And then the third thing is, I think for those of us in unions or who would like to be in unions, that there is a real role to play for labor, and there is a lot of leverage that we could use to aid and support our sisters and brothers in a number of struggles, that are potentially applicable to lots of different situations. Trans people have been targeted by this administration, and I would not be surprised if that drum starts getting beaten louder and louder as we get closer to the midterm elections.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to start developing movements that are willing and able to use that kind of leverage, even though we don't have the trust funds, we don't have the super PACs, we don't have the invites to the Mar-a-Lago or wherever it might be. We do have leverage in our labor and in our numbers, and to try and use those effectively and boldly.
Yeah. And what's your slogan for your union? What's your motto?
Well, we talk about an injury to one is an injury to all, and we really make, it's obviously an old American labor slogan. I think it comes out of the Knights of Labor, going way, way back to the 1800s. But it's, the idea behind it is that any attack, it's not just an attack that could come back to us someday later. I think sometimes that's how people think about it. But for us, what it means is like, if somebody is getting attacked, then we should understand that as an attack on ourselves as well.
Right.
And so we have an obligation to organize defense of ourselves and of our, of our cousins who are under attack. And I think we really we hammer that home. And I think
Yeah.
people generally like that idea. It makes sense to people that we need to stick together and have each other's backs.
Yeah, that's solidarity and that's community. And that's really the community consciousness, so that we're all in this together. And if one person's attacked, we're all attacked. So we all need to respond collectively. And that's the situation we are in right now in terms of authoritarianism and global warming. We're all
Right.
under a threat. So we all need to pull together.
That's right.
So anything we haven't covered? Anything else you want to leave us with?
I mean, I guess I do want to just say, how impressed and grateful, I was to just all the people that are members of our union, but also just different parts of the communities that stood up and stood strong. The Somali community was extremely courageous and brave and funny and, somewhat fearless in standing up to ICE. And I think that really helped everybody get stiffen their spines a little bit. The Native American community, in some ways, the people that should never have to worry about immigration, police of any kind, actually really showed up and helped, I think, clarify the politics about this a lot. In terms of what kind of, who are these people to try and say who can be here and who can't.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and and then just all the young queer folks who've I think through their own experience have really found themselves feeling in solidarity with other people that are under attack and really mobilized. And just in every movement now, you see young queer and trans folks who are kind of taking on responsibilities and initiative, and it's just super impressed to see. And all there were just there's dozens and dozens of stories that are inspiring and heartening, and I'm just so grateful to all of those, to everybody.
Awesome. That's a great way to end it. So thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate you, brother.
Yeah. Happy May Day.
Okay, you too.
I'm so glad Kieran was able to join us today. He has such a wealth of wisdom and experience and decades of organizing. I really appreciate him taking the time to share some of that knowledge with us. One thing I wanted to say, the reason why I brought up whether or not this was a general strike technically or if it was something else, it's because people think general strike, like, oh, I don't want to do anything illegal. Like, we have contracts, we can't strike technically. So this is a way to take action, really effective action, without it being technically being on strike. So you can call in sick if you organize everybody to call in sick. That has the same effect. That's very effective as an action, and it's not illegal. It's totally within your right as an employee, as a union, as a worker to do that. And so that is an effective tool for bringing about social change. So there's different levels, just like we talked about, there's different levels of risk involved in doing a rapid response to ICE. You can be on the front lines documenting stuff, and that's taking on some risk. Or you can be behind the scenes and bringing medicine to people who can't go out to their homes. Or you can be part of a walking bus. So here in Chicago, teachers and parents would go from one child's house to another child's house, picking up kids along the way of people who were undocumented, who couldn't bring their kids to school safely without risking getting abducted. So that's something that's really low level risk. Or running to the store for people who are undocumented, things like that. All very important things to do at different levels. And so the same thing, if you're like, okay, we can't go out on strike, that's against our contract. Okay, but you can all call in sick on a specific day. that is legal. That's something you can do. So that's something that they were doing a lot in Minneapolis, St. Paul, that I really respect that approach and that tactic. So just something to consider. Our story today, it being May Day, comes from history. And so this is Peter Limbaugh's The Incomplete, True, Authentic, and Wonderful History of May Day. So I'm going to read some excerpts from this. And it really gets into both the ecological roots of May Day and also the social roots of May Day. And I think that's perfect for this podcast because we're dealing with both. We're dealing with the ecology and trying to restore the planet, help the planet, and we're also dealing with social injustice and freedom and trying to fight against authoritarianism. So I'm going to read a couple passages from this to capture both the ecological and social roots of May Day, which is being celebrated today, which is May Day. So this is about talking about the beginning, the origins, and this is called the green. As late as Caesar's time, a person might travel through the woods for 2 months without gaining an unobstructed view of the sky. The immense forests of Europe, Asia, Africa, and America provided the atmosphere with oxygen and the earth with nutrients. Within the woodland ecology, our ancestors did not have to work the graveyard shift or deal with flex time or work from 9 to 5. Indeed, the Native Americans whom Captain John Smith encountered in 1606 only worked 4 hours a week. The origin of May Day is to be found in the woodland epic of history. In Europe, as in Africa, people honored the woods in many ways. With the leafing of the trees in the spring, people celebrated the fructifying spirit of vegetation, to use a phrase of J.G. Fraser, the anthropologist. They did this in May, a month named after Maia, the mother of all the gods according to the ancient Greeks, giving birth even to Zeus. The Greeks had their sacred groves, the Druids their oak worship, the Romans their games in honor of Floralia. In Scotland, the herdsmen formed circles and danced around fires. The Celts lit bonfires and hilltops to honor their god Beltane. And in Tyrol, people let their dogs bark and made music with pots and pans. In Scandinavia, fires were lit and the witches came out. Everywhere people went a-maying by going into the woods and bringing back leaf, bough, and blossom to decorate their persons, homes, and loved ones with green garlands. Outside, theater was performed with characters like Jack in the Green and the Queen of May. Trees were planted, maypoles were erected, dances were danced, music was played, drinks were drunk, and love was made. Winter was over, spring had begun. That is the green side of the story. Whatever else it was not a time to work. Therefore, it was attacked by the authorities. In 1550, an act of parliament demanded that maypoles be destroyed, and it outlawed games. In 1644, the Puritans in England abolished May Day altogether. To these work ethicists, the festival was obnoxious for paganism and worldliness. Philip Stubbs, for example, in Anatomy of Abuses, wrote of the maypole, "And then fall they to banquet and feast, to leap and dance about it, as the heathen people did at the dedication of their idols. The people resisted these repressions. Thenceforth they called their May sports the Robin Hood games, capering about with sprigs of hawthorn in their hair and bells jangling from their knees. The ancient charadas of May were transformed into an outlaw community. Maid Marians and Little Johns. The May feast was presided over by, quote, the Lord of Misrule, end quote, and, quote, the King of Unreason, or the Abbot of Inobedience. The struggle was brought to Massachusetts. In 1625, Captain Wollaston, Thomas Morton, and 30 others sailed from England, and months later, taking their bearings from a red cedar tree, they disembarked at Quincy Bay. A year later, Wollaston left for good to Virginia. Thomas Morton settled in a spot he named Marymount. The land seemed a paradise to him. He wrote, "There are fowls in abundance, fish in multitudes, and I discovered besides millions of turtle doves on green boughs, which sat pecking of the full, ripe, pleasant grapes that were supported by the lusty trees, whose fruitful load did cause the arms to bend. On May Day, 1627, he and his Indian friends, stirred by the sound of drums, erected a maypole 80 feet high, decorated it with garlands, wrapped it in ribbons, and nailed to its top the antlers of a buck. Later he wrote that he set up a maypole upon the festival day of Philip and James, and therefore brewed a barrel of excellent beer. They sang a bacchanalian song. Morton attached to the pole the first lyric verses penned in America, which concluded with the proclamation of the 1st of May, a merry mount shall be kept, holiday. The Puritans at Plymouth were opposed to the May Day. They called the maypole an idol and named Merrymount Mount Dagon after the god of the first ocean-going imperialists, the Phoenicians. More likely, though, the Puritans were the imperialists, not Morton, who worked with slaves, servants, Native Americans, person to person. Everyone was equal in his social contract. Governor Bradford wrote, "They also set up a maypole, drinking and dancing about it, many days together, inviting the Indian women for their consorts, dancing and frisking together like so many fairies, or furies rather, and worse practice." Merrymount became a refuge for Indians, the discontented, gay people, runaway servants, and what the governor called all the scum of the country. When the authorities reminded him that his actions violated the king's proclamation, Morton replied that it was no law. Miles Standish, whom Morton called Mr. Shrimp, attacked. The maypole was cut down, the settlement was burned, Morton's goods were confiscated. He was chained and ostracized to England aboard the ship called the Gift. The Rainbow Coalition of Merrymount was thus destroyed for the time being. Thomas Morton was a thorn in the side of the Boston and Plymouth Puritans because he had an alternative vision of Massachusetts. He was impressed by its fertility, they by its scarcity. He befriended the Indians. They shuddered at the thought. He was egalitarian. They proclaimed themselves the quote-unquote elect. He freed servants. They lived off them. He armed Indians. They used arms against the Indians. To Nathaniel Hawthorne, the destiny of American settlement was decided at Merrymount. The history of the modern May Day originates in the center of the North American plains at Haymarket in Chicago, the city on the Make, in the late 19th century. The holiday originated from a movement demanding improved working conditions and greater recognition for workers' contributions. In 1884, a National Federation of Unions announced a campaign to establish an 8-hour workday by May 1st, 1886. Workers in cities across North America went on strike leading up to that date, in one of the era's largest and most tumultuous periods of worker unrest. In May 1886, police in Chicago shot striking workers, prompting activists to organize a protest in the city's Haymarket Square. When a bomb exploded at the protest, killing one police officer and wounding others, police opened fire into the crowd, resulting in the deaths and injuries of both police and protesters. 8 anarchist activists were arrested for inciting violence, even though none were connected with the bomb itself. The ensuing trial was considered by many to be unfair and resulted in the execution of 7 of the 8 men. The series of events would become to known as the Haymarket Incident or the Haymarket Affair. In the years following 1886, international labor groups and socialist advocates endorsed the commemoration of May 1st as International Workers' Day or May Day. As we think about our own times and what's going on now with the erosion of workers' rights, the 8-hour workday was quite the victory for workers' rights. But now we think about Amazon workers, we think about gig workers. People are working much more than 8 hours. 8 hours is not enough to put food on your table, to feed your family, to get some sort of economic security. And if you look at productivity has gone up exponentially. Every year it goes up more and more and more, and yet wages stay flat. So all that extra productivity, all that extra profit is being siphoned off by the 1%. So people are struggling to get by. They're going into debt. They're falling behind. And so now finally workers are starting to wake up. They're starting to organize again. We're starting to form coalitions here in Chicago today on May Day. There's protests, there's boycotts, there's no work, no school, no shopping days. In the public schools, students are doing walkouts. They're allowed to take field trips, to do civil engagement. So I'm really inspired by what's happening in this moment. It's a difficult time, but people are waking up, people are organizing, people are coming together. And that's what's needed if we're going to fight back against authoritarianism, if we're going to stop global warming, if we're going to bring about justice. It's up to us. We're the ones who are going to do it or not. And the way to do it is through collective action, through mutual aid, and through general strikes when necessary. So I hope you've enjoyed today's. So your action item today is to get out into the streets, do something, call somebody, join an organization, get active, get collective, get collectively active. Let's all do this together. So I will see you on the streets. Until then, I'm Michael Glavin. This is Resilience in Dark Times. That's all for this episode of Resilience in Dark Times. Your action items? First, try one strategy we discussed. Second, connect with one person about these issues. Breaking isolation is resistance. And third, leave us a review to help others find this community. For show notes and resources, visit resilienceindarktimes.com. I'm Michael Glavin, reminding you that your resilience is revolutionary. See you next episode.